There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on the door dressed as a Tuesday evening, a simple request, a casual visit from a friend. You let them in without a second thought, because they look familiar, harmless. It's only later, sometimes years later, when you trace the map of your own heart back to its significant turning points, that you realize you were opening the door to an earthquake. It didn't announce itself with a tremor or a roar. It simply walked in, sat down on your couch, and in the ensuing silence, changed the entire landscape of your world. For me, that earthquake had a name. And on that particular Tuesday, he was asleep on my shoulder. He was just dropping by. That was the pretense we both silently agreed to uphold, a fragile piece of fiction that allowed this to happen. Sam had texted me an hour earlier, a simple, "Hey, you home?" that had become his customary overture. He hadn't waited for a reply. He knew I was almost always home in the evenings, a creature of habit tethered to the soft glow of my editing monitor and the quiet solitude of my apartment. He'd arrived with the weariness of a long week clinging to him like a second skin, his smile present but tired, the light in his eyes dimmed to a low flicker. He had brought no food, no movie suggestion, no agenda. He was just dropping by. But he had sat down on my worn, gray couch like a man who had no intention of leaving anytime soon. And now, he was asleep, his head a dead weight against my collarbone, each soft exhalation a warm puff of air against my neck. My own body was a statue carved from pure, unadulterated tension. I hadn't moved a muscle in what felt like an eternity. My left arm, pinned beneath his weight, had long since gone numb, a dull, tingling protest that I steadfastly ignored. My neck ached from the rigid angle I held it at, trying to give him the most comfortable perch possible. Every nerve ending was screamingly aware of the contact points between us. The solid pressure of his skull against my shoulder, the faint, pleasant scent of his shampoo, something clean, like sandalwood and rain, and the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest that moved in tandem with my own. I was a photographer by trade, a professional observer, a man paid to notice the minute details of the world. But I had never studied anything with the intensity one was now directing at the man snoring softly beside me. This was a different kind of observation, a dangerous, forbidden cataloging of sensations that threatened to dismantle the careful fortress I had built around my heart. I could feel the fine, soft texture of his dark hair where it brushed against my jaw. I could see, in my peripheral vision, the sweep of his eyelashes against his cheek, dark crescents resting on skin that was usually animated with laughter or furrowed in concentration. In sleep, his face was stripped of all its usual defenses. The confident swagger and easy charm he presented to the world melted away to reveal something younger, more vulnerable. It was a face I knew better than my own, yet in this proximity, it felt like a foreign country I was visiting for the first time. A country I desperately wanted to explore, but whose borders were fiercely guarded. Our friendship was that border. And for months now, he had been the one to walk right up to the line, pitch a tent, and act as if he had no idea he was trespassing on sacred, volatile ground. It hadn't always been like this. For years, our friendship had been a model of comfortable, platonic stability. It was a room with clearly defined walls, a space I cherished for its safety and its light. We met in a sophomore year elective, a ridiculously easy geology class we both took to fulfill a science requirement. I was the quiet kid in the back, sketching rock formations in my notebook instead of taking notes. He was the guy in the front row who charmed the professor and somehow knew everyone's name by the second week. He'd sat next to me one day because his usual seat was taken, glanced at my sketchbook, and instead of making a joke, he'd asked a genuine question about light and shadow. That was Sam. He had this disarming ability to see past the surface, to find a point of connection with an earnest curiosity that felt both rare and incredibly precious. From that first conversation about basalt and graphite pencils, a friendship bloomed, easy and unforced. It was built on a foundation of late-night study sessions that devolved into debates about terrible movies, shared pizzas on cheap apartment floors, and the kind of mutual understanding that required few words. He was the anchor to my drift, the one who would drag me out of my solitary artist's cave and into the sunlight. I was his quiet harbor, the place he came to when the noise of his own life became too much. He was studying to be a software engineer, his mind a brilliant, ordered place of logic and code, a stark contrast to my own, which operated on instinct, feeling, and light. We were a study in opposites, yet we fit together with a startling, seamless ease. For me, the shift, the quiet, internal tectonic plate slip, happened about 2 years after we graduated. It wasn't a sudden revelation, no cinematic bolt from the blue. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was watching him across a crowded bar, laughing with a group of our mutual friends, the light catching the genuine joy in his eyes, and feeling a pang in my chest that was so sharp, so specific, it stole my breath. It wasn't envy. It wasn't just affection. It was a deep, resonant ache of wanting. Wanting to be the source of that laugh. Wanting to be the one he looked at with that unguarded warmth. It was the realization that the comfortable room of our friendship now had a door I was terrified to open, for fear of what lay on the other side, and for fear of destroying the room itself. So I became a master of concealment. I was a cartographer of my own heart, carefully labeling all the dangerous territories and then folding the map away where no one, least of all Sam, could ever find it. I dated, or at least, I went through the motions. I listened with practiced patience as he talked about the women in his life, offering sage, neutral advice while my own insides twisted into knots. I watched him fall in love with a woman named Chloe, a bright, bubbly architect who, for 2 years, seemed to be his perfect match. I photographed their engagement party, my camera a welcome shield, the viewfinder a filter that allowed me to observe their happiness from a safe, professional distance. Each click of the shutter felt like a small act of self-flagellation, capturing forever the image of the man I loved pledging his future to someone else. I was the best friend, the quiet, supportive, reliable best friend. It was a role I played with Oscar-worthy dedication, because the alternative was losing him entirely, and that was a prospect I couldn't bear to entertain. When he and Chloe broke up, it was messy and sudden, an implosion rather than a gentle drifting apart. He never told me the full story, but I pieced it together from the fragments he offered in late-night phone calls and the profound exhaustion that settled deep into his bones. It was about mismatched futures, about her desire to plant roots and his restless need to keep moving, a need driven by a high-pressure consulting job that had him living out of a suitcase more often than not. The breakup gutted him, not just because he'd lost her, but because it confirmed his deepest fear, that he was built for transit, not for permanence. That was the catalyst. That was the beginning of the shift. His heartbreak, combined with the crushing weight of a project that was demanding 70-hour work weeks, left him hollowed out. The confident, easygoing Sam I knew was replaced by a quieter, more fragile version. He started seeking silence instead of distraction, and my apartment, my quiet harbor, became his preferred destination. It started with him just showing up, often late at night, with the excuse that he was in the neighborhood. My neighborhood was nowhere near his office or his sterile corporate apartment. It was a lie, but it was a gentle one, a piece of gauze to wrap around the raw, unspoken need. He wouldn't talk much. He'd just sink into that gray couch, watch me edit photos, and slowly, the frantic energy would drain out of him. He was like a vessel that had been tossed in a storm, and my quiet living room was the calm water where he could finally stop rocking. I became a student of his exhaustion. I learned the different shades of it. There was the wired, brittle exhaustion from too much caffeine and not enough sleep, where he'd pace my small apartment like a caged animal. There was the heavy, boneless exhaustion of defeat, where he'd slump onto the sofa and stare at the ceiling for an hour without speaking. And then there was the soft, yielding exhaustion, the one that was visiting tonight, where he simply gave in to his body's demand for rest. I never pushed him to talk. I just refilled his water glass, or put a blanket over him if he drifted off, and continued with my own work. I was the keeper of the lighthouse, and my one job was to keep the light on and let him find his own way to shore. The first time he fell asleep on me, it was an accident, a complete, uncalculated slip. We were watching some mindless action movie, a comfortable background noise. He'd been leaning against the arm of the couch, and as the movie wore on, his head began to list, slowly, incrementally, toward me. I watched its slow descent out of the corner of my eye, my own body rigid with a kind of terrified anticipation. It felt like watching a glass wobble on the edge of a table. Part of me wanted to catch it, to gently push him back upright and restore the safe distance between us. But a larger, more treacherous part of me wanted to let it fall. When his head finally came to rest on my shoulder, it was with a soft little sigh of surrender. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't stir. His breathing deepened, and I knew he was truly asleep. I sat there for the entire 2-hour movie, a prisoner of his trust and my own treacherous hope. That first time became a blueprint. It established a new, unspoken permission. The next time he came over, exhausted and frayed, he didn't even pretend to watch the movie. He just sat beside me, and after a few minutes of silence, he leaned his head against my shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't ask. He just did it. And I, in my silence, consented. This became our ritual, a silent communion built on his need for rest and my capacity to provide it. It was a dangerous, addictive routine. Each time it happened, the carefully constructed walls of my self-control crumbled a little more. I was letting the enemy into the fortress, not realizing that the enemy was my own hope, a wild and overgrown thing that was threatening to take over everything. The couch was one thing. The couch was a semi-public space, a gray area where lines could be blurred under the guise of casual, friendly comfort. The bedroom was another territory entirely. It was a private, intimate space, a room with a door that, for me, had always been a symbolic boundary. A boundary he crossed one brutal winter night. A storm had blown in, coating the city in a thick, treacherous layer of ice. Sam had been at my place since dinner. He'd helped me cook, a rare burst of domestic energy, and we'd eaten in comfortable silence. The storm raged outside, rattling the old windows of my building. By 10 o'clock, the news was advising everyone to stay off the roads. He stood by the window, peering out at the streetlights haloed in freezing rain. "Looks like I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice flat. He turned to me, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher in his eyes. Anxiety? Resignation? "Hey, I don't suppose I could just crash on your couch? I've got to be on a call at 6 a.m., and I don't want to risk the drive." My heart did a slow, painful lurch. "Of course," I said, my voice sounding impressively casual. "The couch is all yours. You know where the extra blankets are." I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me, leaning against it as if to physically hold my own chaotic feelings at bay. I could hear him moving around in the living room, the rustle of blankets, the soft thud of a cushion being moved. I got into my own bed, the vast, empty space of it feeling more pronounced than ever. I lay in the dark, listening. The sounds from the living room ceased. There was only the howling of the wind and the frantic beating of my own heart. I tried to sleep, but my mind was a racetrack. He was just a few feet away, separated only by a thin wall and a closed door. He was in my home, asleep on my couch. It was too much and not enough, all at once. After an hour of staring at the dark ceiling, I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I heard a soft, tentative knock on my bedroom door. It was so quiet I thought I might have imagined it, a product of my own wishful thinking. "Leo." His voice was a low whisper, barely audible over the storm. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Yeah." The door creaked open a few inches. His silhouette was a dark shape against the faint light from the living room. "Sorry to bug you," he whispered. "It's just my back is killing me on this couch. It's like sleeping on a pile of bricks." He paused, and in that silence, a million unspoken things hung in the air. "Would it be completely weird if I just took the other side of your bed? I promise I'll stay on my side. It's just, I really need to get some sleep." This was it. This was the moment where the map was redrawn. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to say no, to protect myself, to maintain the boundary, to offer him more pillows, an air mattress, anything but this. But the rational part of my brain was a tiny, distant voice, drowned out by the roar of a tidal wave of yearning that had been building for years. "No," I heard myself say, my own voice a whisper. "It's not weird. Come on in." He slipped into the room, closing the door softly behind him, plunging the space into near-total darkness. I heard the quiet rustle of his clothes as he presumably took off his jeans, and then the bed dipped on the other side. He slid under the covers, his movements careful, deliberate. He lay on his back, a rigid line of tension on his side of the mattress, a good 2 feet of space between us. A chasm. The air was thick with a silence that was louder than any storm. We were two statues lying side by side in a sarcophagus. "Thanks, man," he murmured into the darkness. "No problem," I breathed. Sleep was an impossibility. I was hyper-aware of everything. The subtle change in the weight of the mattress. The sound of his breathing, slow and even, but not yet the deep rhythm of sleep. The faint scent of him, now mingled with the clean smell of my own laundry detergent on the sheets. It was an agony of proximity. He was right there. A simple roll, a reach of an arm, and I could touch him. But that was a line I would never cross. He had to be the one. He had set these new, terrifying rules, and I could only follow his lead, my heart in my throat every step of the way. Eventually, his breathing did deepen. The tension in his body seemed to dissolve, and in his sleep, he shifted, rolling onto his side. Away from me, I felt a pang of something that felt ridiculously like rejection, which was insane. He was asleep. He was unconscious. And yet, a small, irrational part of me had hoped he would roll toward me. I turned onto my own side, facing his back, and watched the faint outline of his shoulders rise and fall in the dark. This was our new ritual, I realized. This was the next, terrifying evolution, and I had no idea how I was going to survive it. That night established the new precedent. The couch was tacitly retired. His late-night visits, which became more frequent, now ended with him in my bed. The pretense varied. Sometimes it was an early meeting he didn't want to be late for. Sometimes it was the admission that he just slept better here, away from the sterile emptiness of his own apartment. He always framed it as a matter of convenience, a practical solution. He never acknowledged the monumental shift it represented. He never acknowledged the intimacy of sharing a bed, of breathing the same air in the dark, of waking up in the same room. His plausible deniability was a fortress, and he lived inside it, seemingly oblivious to the emotional chaos he was creating in me. For me, those nights were a form of exquisite torture. I became an insomniac, a connoisseur of the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. I would lie there, perfectly still, listening to him sleep. Sometimes, in the depths of the night, he would murmur something, a fragmented word from a dream. Sometimes he would shift, and his hand would brush against mine, or his knee would knock against my leg. Each accidental touch was like a jolt of electricity, a shock that would leave me wide-eyed and breathless in the dark. I was a scientist studying a volatile, unpredictable element, and I was getting closer and closer to the point of nuclear reaction, all while pretending it was just a simple experiment in friendship. I started to see my life through the lens of his presence. My apartment wasn't just my space anymore. It was the place he came to find peace. The other side of my bed wasn't empty. It was waiting for him. I bought a different kind of coffee because I knew he preferred it. I found myself keeping his favorite brand of beer in the fridge, just in case. My life was slowly, unconsciously reconfiguring itself around him, making a space for him that he hadn't explicitly asked for, but seemed to desperately need. I was building a home for him within my own life, all while telling myself I was just being a good friend. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking act of self-deception. One night, the slow, incremental escalation took another step. He'd had a particularly brutal week. The big project had finally launched, but it was riddled with bugs, and he and his team were in a constant state of crisis management. He showed up at my door looking like a ghost, his face pale, dark circles like bruises under his eyes. He didn't even speak when I opened the door. He just walked past me, dropped his bag on the floor, and went straight to my bedroom. I found him a moment later, already under the covers, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. I stood in the doorway, my heart aching for him. "Rough one?" I asked softly. He just nodded, not looking at me. His eyes were glassy. "I'm so tired, Leo," he said, his voice thick with an exhaustion that went far beyond physical. "I'm just so tired of everything." I didn't know what to do. The usual routine felt inadequate. He seemed broken in a way I hadn't seen before. I walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, near his feet. I didn't speak. I just sat there, offering my presence as a silent form of comfort. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sound in the room his unsteady breathing. Then, he shifted, rolling onto his side to face me. His eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability that was terrifying to behold. "Would you?" He started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Never mind. It's stupid." "What is it?" I prompted, my voice gentle. He looked away at the wall. Could you just lie down? For a minute, he whispered. It wasn't a request for me to go to sleep. It was something else. A plea. I swung my legs up onto the bed and lay down on top of the covers, facing him. There was still a foot of space between us, but the air was charged with a different kind of energy tonight. It wasn't about sleep. It was about comfort. Raw, unadorned comfort. He looked at me, his gaze searching my face in the dim light filtering in from the street. I feel like I'm going to just fly apart, he said, his voice barely audible. And then he did it. He closed the distance. He moved across the small space between us and curled up against me, pressing his face into my chest like a child seeking refuge from a nightmare. His arm came around my waist, holding on with a surprising strength. I froze, my entire body going rigid. This was new. This was a deliberate act of seeking physical comfort that could not be misinterpreted as accidental. This was him, consciously and deliberately, holding on to me. My mind went completely blank. All the analysis, all the fear, all the carefully constructed walls, they all evaporated in an instant. All that was left was the stunning, overwhelming reality of him in my arms. His body was tense, a tightly wound spring of anxiety and exhaustion. Instinct took over where thought had failed. I slowly, tentatively, raised my arm and rested it on his back. I started to rub a slow, steady circle between his shoulder blades, the way you would to soothe a frightened animal or a crying child. At my touch, something in him broke. A shudder went through his entire body, and he let out a long, ragged breath against my shirt. He didn't cry, but it felt like he was releasing a pain that was too deep for tears. He just held on tighter, his face buried in my chest, and I kept rubbing his back, my own heart hammering a frantic, unsteady rhythm. We lay like that for what could have been minutes or hours. The photographer in me, the observer, was gone. I wasn't analyzing the light or the composition of the moment. I was just in it. I was a part of it. I was no longer a harbor. I was the anchor. He eventually fell asleep like that, his grip on my waist loosening, his breathing finally deepening into a steady, peaceful rhythm. I didn't move. I couldn't. I lay there, his warm weight a solid, grounding presence against me, and I felt a sense of profound, terrifying peace. This was what I had wanted for years, a reality so far beyond my wildest imaginings that I had never even dared to fantasize about it. And now it was here, and it was built on his pain. The thought was a bitter pill. Was I just a human tranquilizer? A convenient, warm body he could use to self-soothe when the world became too much? The cynical part of my brain, the part that had been my shield for so long, whispered that this was all it was. But the part of me that was currently holding him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my own, couldn't bring itself to believe it. There was a vulnerability in his surrender that felt like more than just convenience. It felt like trust, a deep, implicit trust that I was a safe place for him to fall apart. And maybe, just maybe, that was a form of love in itself. This became the new pinnacle of our ritual. The nights he stayed over, he no longer kept to his side of the bed. He would start there, but sometime in the darkness, he would migrate, seeking contact. Sometimes he would just press his back against mine, a solid line of warmth. Other times, he would end up as he was that first night, curled against my front, his head on my chest, my arms around him. I stopped fighting sleep. I learned to drift off with the weight of him against me, a reality that my body accepted far more easily than my mind. Waking up was the hardest part. I would open my eyes in the pale morning light, and for a few blissful, disoriented seconds, I would forget the complexity of it all. I would just feel the simple, profound rightness of him being there. Then consciousness would return, and with it, the anxiety. The fear of the moment he would wake up, pull away, and the fragile magic of the night would be broken by the harsh, clarifying light of day. He always woke up first. He was a natural early riser, his internal clock set by years of demanding schedules. I would feel him stir, a subtle shift in weight and pressure. He would detangle himself from me with a quiet, practiced ease, as if trying not to wake me. I learned to pretend to be asleep, to keep my breathing even and my eyes closed. It was an act of self-preservation. I couldn't bear to see the look on his face in that moment of separation. Would it be regret? Awkwardness? Or just the blankness of a man moving on to the next task of his day? It was easier to hide in the fiction of sleep, To let him leave the room and close the door before I had to face the day and the ambiguity he left in his wake. He would usually be gone before I even got out of bed, a quiet text message his only goodbye. Thanks for last night. Left you some coffee. The coffee was a small, kind gesture, but it felt like a payment. A thank you for services rendered. It kept things in the neat, tidy box of friendship, of favors done and repaid. It was a way of saying, this doesn't have to mean anything, but it did mean something. It meant everything. My entire world had been reoriented around these nights of shared silence and unconscious intimacy. I was living a half-life, fully alive only in the dark, and spending my days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for his next "Hey, you home?" text. I was a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom, the image becoming clearer and clearer, but I was terrified of what would happen when it was finally exposed to the light. Would the image be beautiful, or would it simply burn away to nothing? The crossing happened on a night that was utterly ordinary. There was no storm, no major crisis at his work. He had simply shown up after dinner, claiming he was bored. We talked for hours, the conversation easy and meandering, a throwback to the early days of our friendship. We talked about photography, about a new coding language he was learning, about a stupid documentary we'd both seen. There was no exhaustion clinging to him, no profound sadness in his eyes. He was just Sam. My Sam. The one I had first become friends with, and the one I had irrevocably fallen in love with. Around midnight, he stifled a yawn. I should probably head out, he said, but he made no move to stand up. He just looked at me, a soft, contemplative expression on his face. You can stay, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could second-guess them. It wasn't an offer of the couch or a bed for a man too tired to drive. It was an invitation. He held my gaze for a long moment, and the air between us shifted. The comfortable quiet became something else, something thick and charged. Yeah, he said softly. Okay. We went to the bedroom in a shared, unspoken accord. There was no pretense this time. No mention of his back or an early meeting. We were two people who were choosing to share a space. He changed in the bathroom while I changed in the bedroom. A small, almost comical return to a modesty we had long since abandoned in the dark. When he came back into the room, I was already in bed, lying on my side, facing his. He got in and mirrored my position, lying on his side to face me. The small lamp on my nightstand was still on, casting a soft, warm glow over the room. We weren't hiding in the darkness tonight. We lay there, just looking at each other. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things we hadn't said for months, for years. I could see the pulse beating in his throat. I was sure he could see the same in mine. My heart was a drum, loud and steady. I was terrified, but for the first time, I wasn't anxious. I felt strangely calm, as if I had been walking toward this moment my entire life. He was the one who broke the silence. His voice was a low, rough whisper. Leo? Yeah. My own voice was steady. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just watched my face, his expression unreadable. Then, he took a breath. What are we doing? It was the question. The one I had been asking myself every night for the past 6 months. The question I had no answer for. I could only offer him the truth. I don't know, Sam. He absorbed that, his gaze unwavering. This helps, he said, his voice barely audible. Being here. With you. It's the only time my brain shuts up. It's the only time I feel settled. He paused, searching for the right word. It feels like coming home. My breath hitched. Coming home. The words were a key, unlocking a door deep inside me that I had kept bolted shut for years. Hope, bright and blinding, flooded in. He saw the shift in my expression. He saw everything. He always did. He took another shaky breath, and the vulnerability in his eyes was so profound it made my own chest ache. Would it be okay? He whispered, the words tentative, fragile, as if he was afraid they would shatter in the air between us. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The sound of the traffic outside, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, my own frantic heartbeat. It all faded away into a dull, distant roar. All that existed was his question, hanging in the soft, warm light between us. It wasn't a proposition. It wasn't a move. It was a plea for permission. It was an admission of a desire he seemed to be discovering in the very act of speaking it. He was giving me all the power. The choice was mine. I could say no, and we would retreat, and things would be irrevocably broken between us. Or I could say yes, and things would be irrevocably changed. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The words were trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat. So I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. He moved with an agonizing slowness, closing the small distance that separated us. His eyes never left mine, as if he was still asking for reassurance, even now. I could feel the warmth of his body before he even touched me. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my cheek. The touch was electric, a current that shot through my entire body. And then, he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It was the gentlest of kisses. It was soft and hesitant and deeply uncertain. It wasn't about passion or lust. It was a question. It was a confession. It was a surrender. His lips were warm and dry, and they trembled slightly against mine. I responded with equal gentleness, a soft pressure, an answer to his question. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it contained the entire history of our friendship, all the unspoken yearning, all the fear, all the hope. When he pulled back, his forehead came to rest against mine. His eyes were closed. His hand was still on my cheek. Okay, he breathed out, a single word that sounded like both a discovery and a relief. Okay, I whispered back. He opened his eyes, and the look in them was one of dawning wonder, as if he had just solved a complex equation that had been baffling him for years, and the answer was simpler and more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. He didn't say anything else. He just kissed me again, and this time there was less hesitation, more certainty. It was still gentle, but it was deeper, a slow, unfolding exploration. And I met him there, in that new, uncharted space between us, my heart finally at peace. The earthquake had arrived, and the ground had shifted beneath my feet, but I wasn't falling. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely, utterly grounded. I fell asleep that night wrapped in his arms, his lips still warm against my hair, the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing a lullaby against my ear. It was the first truly peaceful sleep I'd had in months. There was no anxiety, no overanalysis, just the profound, bone-deep certainty of the moment. We had crossed the line. We had opened the door. Whatever came next, we would face it from this new place, this shared territory we had just claimed. The morning broke the spell. I woke to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold. I sat bolt upright, my heart sinking with a familiar, dreadful weight. The soft morning light streamed in through the window, illuminating the stark reality of his absence. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar. I listened. The apartment was silent. No sound of the shower, no clink of the coffee pot. He was gone. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands trembling. There was one new message. From him. Sent an hour ago. My stomach twisted into a knot of dread. I opened it. I'm sorry. I had to go. That was it. No, thanks for last night. No, left you some coffee. Just 4 words that felt like a slap in the face. I'm sorry for what? Sorry for leaving? Or sorry for the kiss? Sorry for everything? The ambiguity was a special kind of cruelty. The beautiful, fragile certainty of the previous night shattered into a million pieces. The ground I had felt so solid beneath me had turned to quicksand. I spent the day in a fog of hurt and confusion. I replayed the entire night in my head, searching for a sign I had missed. Had I misread everything? Was the kiss a mistake? A moment of weakness on his part, born of loneliness and confusion, that he now regretted in the harsh light of day? The thought was a physical pain, a hollow ache in my chest. The quiet observer in me, the analyst, came roaring back to life, dissecting every word, every touch, every glance. The wonder in his eyes, had I imagined it? The relief in his voice, was it just a product of my own desperate hope? I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar comfort of editing photos, but the images on the screen were just meaningless shapes and colors. My apartment, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene. Every surface held a memory of him, a ghost of his presence. The indent on the couch cushion, the coffee mug he'd used, the bed, with the sheets still rumpled on his side. The space felt haunted by the ghost of a future that had lasted less than 8 hours. I didn't hear from him for 2 days. 2 days of agonizing silence. My calls went to his voicemail. My texts were left unread, 2 stark blue check marks on my screen that felt like a judgment. The silence was worse than an argument. It was a void, and my mind rushed to fill it with the worst possible scenarios. He was ashamed. He was disgusted. He was trying to figure out how to let me down easy, how to salvage the friendship he had so carelessly broken. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest withered and died, leaving behind a bitter, cold ash. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful fool who had mistaken a moment of temporary need for a declaration of love. By the 3rd day, the hurt had curdled into a slow, simmering anger. Anger at him, for his cowardice, for his carelessness with my heart. But also, anger at myself, for being so passive, for letting him set all the terms, for living in the shadows of his needs for so long. The quiet observer had to die. He had observed enough. It was time to act. I couldn't live in this limbo. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I was dreading. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the finality of it. I drove to his apartment. It was a sterile, impersonal building in a neighborhood that felt like it had been designed by a committee. All glass and steel and manicured, soulless green spaces. I had only been there a handful of times. He never invited people over. It was a place to sleep, not to live. As I stood in the lobby, waiting for the elevator, I realized why he was always at my place. My apartment, with its worn furniture and stacks of books and photos taped to the walls, was a home. His was just a box. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I could hear the faint sound of a television inside. For a long moment, there was no response. I was about to knock again when the door opened a crack. He peered out, and the look on his face was a cocktail of shock, guilt, and exhaustion. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants he'd been in for days. His hair was a mess, and the dark circles under his eyes were deeper than I'd ever seen them. "Leo," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't open the door any further. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice colder and harder than I intended. He hesitated, then sighed and opened the door, stepping back to let me in. The apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the kitchen counter. Clothes were strewn over the furniture. The air was stale. It was the physical manifestation of his mental state. He didn't meet my eyes. He just walked over to the massive window that overlooked the city and stood with his back to me. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice quiet. "What do you think I'm doing here, Sam?" I shot back, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "You can't just do what you did and then disappear. You don't get to do that. Not to me." He flinched, but he didn't turn around. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. Stop saying that." I said, my voice rising. "What are you sorry for? For kissing me? Or for running away like a coward the morning after? I need you to be specific because I am losing my mind here." He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "Leo, I swear to God, I don't know." "That's not good enough." I took a step toward him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "For months, you have been coming into my home, into my space, into my bed. You have been taking a comfort from me that you know damn well goes beyond friendship. I let you do it. I let you do it because I'm in love with you. I have been in love with you for years. You idiot." The confession tumbled out of me, raw and unplanned, fueled by a potent combination of anger and heartbreak. "And I thought, for one night, I thought maybe you felt it too. But you just ran. So I need you to tell me, right now. What was that? Was it all just a game? Was I just a convenient warm body? Was it a mistake?" He stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. The confession of my feelings seemed to have stunned him into silence. He looked from my eyes down to the floor, then back up again. He looked completely lost. "A mistake," he finally whispered, shaking his head slowly. "No. God, no, it wasn't a mistake." He took a shaky step towards me. "Leo, kissing you, it was the first thing that's felt real in I don't know how long. It felt like I could finally breathe." He ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated. "And that's what scared the hell out of me." "Scared you?" I asked, my anger beginning to be replaced by a painful confusion. "Why would that scare you?" "Because," he exclaimed, his voice finally rising to match my own. "Because I don't know what it means. I don't look at guys that way. I've never looked at anyone the way I look at you, but I didn't know that's what it was. I just knew I needed to be near you. I knew that your apartment was the only place in the world where I didn't feel like I was vibrating out of my own skin. I knew that sleeping next to you was the only way I could actually sleep. I didn't let myself think about why. He paced the small space between the couch and the window, a caged animal in his own sterile cage. And then I kissed you, and it was right. It felt more right than anything with Chloe ever did. And the next morning, I woke up, and you were there, and you were so peaceful, and I felt this terror, because it felt like a home. And I destroy homes, Leo. That's what I do. I'm not built for it. I'm good for a little while, and then I get restless, or I mess it up. I saw that future with you in that one moment, and I knew I would ruin it. I knew I would ruin you. And I couldn't. I can't ruin you. You're the only good, solid thing in my entire life. So I ran. I ran because I was trying to protect you from me. His confession, his fear, his twisted, backward logic, it all came crashing down on me. He hadn't run because he was disgusted. He had run because he was terrified of his own feelings, of their intensity, of what they meant. He had run because he thought he was protecting me. The anger drained out of me completely, replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man who was so convinced he was broken that he would rather shatter his own heart than risk scratching someone else's. I closed the distance between us and took his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. His eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "You idiot," I said again. But this time, the words were soft, full of an affection that surprised even me. "You monumental idiot. You don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to decide that I need protecting from you. My life, my heart, they're not as fragile as you think. What's fragile is this thing between us that you keep trying to run away from." I rested my forehead against his, just as he had done after our first kiss. "I'm not scared, Sam," I whispered. "I'm not scared of you. I'm not scared of this. The only thing I'm scared of is losing you because you're too afraid to even try." A single tear finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. "I don't know how," he choked out. "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I admitted. "But we can figure it out. Together." I pulled back slightly, my hands still framing his face. "You just have to stop running. Can you do that? Can you just stay?" He looked at me, his gaze searching mine, and in his eyes, I saw the war he was fighting with himself. The fear was still there, a powerful, deep-rooted thing. But there was something else, too. A flicker of hope. A willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as broken as he thought. He nodded slowly, a single, decisive movement. "Okay," he whispered, the same word he had uttered after our first kiss. A word of relief. A word of surrender. "I'll stay." We didn't magically fix everything in that moment. The fear and confusion didn't just evaporate. But we had found a new foundation, one built not on pretense and plausible deniability, but on a raw and terrifying honesty. He stayed at my apartment that night, and the next, and the one after that. He didn't go back to his sterile box of an apartment except to pack a bag. He slowly, tentatively, began to move his life into mine. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of navigation. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where he would retreat into himself, the old fear resurfacing. But I learned to be patient, to give him space without letting him run. I learned that sometimes the best thing I could do was to just sit beside him in silence, a quiet, steady presence that reminded him I wasn't going anywhere. And he learned, slowly, to trust it. He learned that my affection wasn't conditional, that my presence wasn't a temporary comfort. He learned that he could be messy and confused and scared, and I would still be there. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. When he reached for me in the middle of the night, it wasn't an unconscious act of a sleeping man. It was a choice, a conscious seeking of closeness. The kisses were no longer just questions. They were affirmations. They were quiet conversations in a language we were both learning together. We talked. We had the conversations we should have had months ago. He told me about the pressure he felt to live up to a certain image of success, the restlessness that he had mistaken for a personality trait instead of a symptom of his own loneliness. I told him about the years of quiet yearning, about the ache of watching him with other people, about the fear of losing our friendship. We laid all our cards on the table, all our fears and insecurities, and we found that they weren't as monstrous in the light as they had been in the dark. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and saw him standing in the doorway of the bedroom, a mug in each hand. He was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The kind of smile I hadn't seen in a very long time. "I made coffee," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I smiled back. "I see that." He walked over and handed me a mug, then sat on the edge of the bed. We drank our coffee in a comfortable, easy silence. The morning light filled the room, and it didn't feel harsh or clarifying. It felt warm and gentle. It felt like a beginning. After a few minutes, he put his mug down and just looked at me, his expression soft. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For the coffee." He shook his head. "For not giving up on me." "I told you," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to believe that." And so we began to build our new normal. It was a quiet, unassuming thing. It was made of shared meals and inside jokes. It was him learning the settings on my camera and me learning the difference between Java and Python. It was his toothbrush appearing in the holder next to mine, a small, mundane object that felt like a profound declaration of permanence. It was the nights we spent in bed, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes just holding each other in a silence that was no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a deep and abiding peace. The door to my bedroom was now closed at night, not to keep feelings at bay, but to keep the world out, to create a space that was just for us. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and you let them in. You let them sleep on your shoulder, you let them into your bed, you let them into your heart. You don't know that they are an earthquake, a force that will rearrange the entire geography of your soul. But you learn that sometimes, the most beautiful landscapes are the ones that are created in the aftermath of a tremor. The ground is broken open, but it is in those new chasms that rivers begin to flow, and it is on that shifted earth that new things have a chance to grow. He had been my earthquake, and in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together, we were beginning to build our home.